Let's have a more in-depth look at that short-run supply curve in the economy. So the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, but notice that it is curved. If this is the full employment level, full employment, you can see that it is relatively flat on the left section of the full employment level, but it's relatively steep on the right section of the full employment level. This means that for a small increase in the price, you can increase a lot in output. The reason for that is below the full employment level, there's going to be quite a lot of unemployment and resources aren't going to be used. A lot of resources are not going to be taken advantage of. So with a small increase in price, firms can hire all these resources with a very small increase in the wage rate. So if there's a small increase in the wage rate, they can hire a whole lot more workers and get a lot more output out of them because they haven't got to that full employment level. Past that full employment level, there are going to be too many firms looking for laborers to come into play. There are not going to be enough laborers, and so to entice them to come play, they have to increase the price of those resources even further, and the larger increase will only result in a smaller increase in output. So that's why the aggregate supply curve is shaped such as that. Determinants of the aggregate supply curve are all a result of the per unit production costs in a process. So this supply cost will shift outwards if the per unit production costs decrease, and it will shift to the left if the per unit production costs increase. These per unit production costs can be influenced by factors such as resource prices. If you used oil and steel in your production process and the price of oil increased, your per unit production cost is going to increase, and so it's going to shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. If the raw material prices decreased, your per unit production cost will decrease and it will shift your aggregate supply curve to the right. Another factor that can shift the aggregate supply curve is market power in terms of who controls the resource. The best example is OPEC. When they had a large amount of market power, they could influence the price and push the price upwards. This would shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. However, if market power decreased and there was more competition in the price of resources, prices would decrease and you could shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Another factor that can change the aggregate supply curve is productivity. If productivity were to increase from labor or capital, then they would be able to produce more of the goods in the same time, and so your per unit production costs would decrease because you're still paying them the same amount of wage or the same capital rental ratio. So if the productivity increased, once again you would be able to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. The last factor that can shift the aggregate supply curve is the legal environment. In South Africa, there is a lot of red tape involved in medium-sized businesses. That is a cost to the business. So it'll increase the per unit production costs of that business in South Africa, and it'll shift their aggregate supply curve to the left. And we're going to now combine the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve and see what happens in equilibrium and what analysis we can get from that.